Last week, I was having coffee with an old acquaintance of mine, someone who'd recently been promoted within a major European regulatory body. And he was practically vibrating with this sense of purpose. He leans over his espresso and tells me with just complete sincerity that they were finally writing the Constitution for the future of humanity.
Wow.
He was talking, of course, about the new AI Act. To him, this wasn't just some set of rules, It was a masterpiece of what he called technological sovereignty. He even showed me this flowchart on his tablet.
Oh, boy.
It was this dizzying web of high-risk classifications, conformity assessments, administrative checkpoints. And he was so proud of the complexity, he described it as a filter that would ensure only ethical innovation survived.
A filter, right.
But the really interesting part was his reaction when I asked about a specific AI startup, a highly regarded one from his own home city that had just announced it was moving its primary operations to Singapore.
Okay, and what did he say?
His expression, it didn't shift into concern at all. Instead, he just dismissed them with a wave of his hand. He said, if they can't handle the compliance, then they aren't the kind of excellence we want in Europe anyway.
So the problem wasn't the regulation, it was the company.
Exactly. He seemed genuinely convinced that by making the hurdle higher, he was somehow making the athletes better. The fact that the track was now empty wasn't a failure to him. It was a sign that the standards were finally high enough.
That is a fascinating mindset.
But then the conversation took a sharp turn. I mentioned a recent breakthrough from a lab in Tel Aviv. A really lean, agile project that was already outperforming the legacy systems he was trying to protect.
And his confidence wavered.
For the first time, yeah. He didn't ask how the tech worked or what Europe could learn from it. His very first instinct was to check if their data scraping methods violated some specific obscure clause in a 2026 framework.
He was looking for a reason to ban it, not a way to compete with it.
Precisely. Watching him, it felt like I was looking at a modern-day architect of the Maginot Line. Someone so obsessed with the thickness of his concrete walls that he'd forgotten the enemy has planes. This shift from creation to prohibition, this defensive narcissism masked as moral superiority, it feels like more than just a legal disagreement.
It is. It's a clinical symptom of a civilization choosing to build a digital fortress that is very quickly becoming its own high-tech prison.
And that anecdote you just shared, it immediately gets right to the heart of the fundamental strategic confusion that's underpinning the entire European digital strategy. It perfectly captures why Europe is struggling so much to transition from industrial dominance to digital leadership.
You hear these two phrases all the time, right? In the halls of Brussels, among policymakers, in the press, technological sovereignty and digital sovereignty. They get used almost interchangeably.
But they're not the same thing at all.
Not even close. And the distinction between them is absolutely critical to understanding the current crisis.
Okay, so let's unpack this core distinction then. It sounds to me like one is about capacity, the ability to do something, and the other is more about control. What's the precise fundamental difference we need to grasp here? Because it really does seem like the EU is deliberately blurring those lines.
You hit the nail on the head. One is the foundation, and the other is just the dependent outcome. Technological sovereignty is the foundational concept. It's the ability to build.
Right.
This relates to structural capacities. Think of the tangible things, who owns the network infrastructure, the fiber, the 5G towers, who manufactures the microchips, where are the actual data centers located, what's the quality of the hardware and software development ecosystem, and critically, where is the early stage R&D funding and the VC money coming from?
So it's the industrial, the physical, the intellectual engine room that actually generates future technology.
That's it, exactly.
So if you don't control the means of production, the IP, the manufacturing, the capital, you just don't have technological sovereignty. That makes perfect sense.
Precisely. Now, digital sovereignty, that's the dependent outcome. This is the capacity and the legal authority to control the outcomes of technology through regulatory and legal frameworks.
The rule book.
The rule book. Things like data protection, competition policy, platform governance, taxation of digital assets. It's the ability to referee the game, to set the rules for data protection or content moderation, regardless of who actually built the platform or the algorithm.
So if the central argument is that the EU is focusing so intensely on defining the rules on digital sovereignty, while at the same time completely neglecting its structural capacity, its technological sovereignty, what's the inevitable consequence of that imbalance?
The consequence is that Europe is asserting a control it hasn't actually earned. You see, technological sovereignty is the only stable foundation upon which digital sovereignty can possibly rest. You can't effectively control outcomes if you lack the structural capacity to create those outcomes yourself, or if you're entirely dependent on foreign powers for the underlying technology.
So you're just a referee in a game where you don't own any of the teams or the stadium?
Perfect analogy. And the EU's exhaustive focus on regulation, on defining the ethical limits of the digital age, it often serves as a massive cultural defense mechanism. It's a form of, well, collective narcissism that obscures its profound weakness in actually creating that future. As your friend in the cafe showed, the instinct becomes prohibition over creation.
It's the difference between being a global player and just being a really well-regulated market that others treat as an accessible, high-standard customer base, which brings us directly to the current situation.
The truth is that the EU is caught in a profound paradox. It is, without a doubt, a regulatory superpower. We all celebrate the Brussels effect, right?
Right.
Where European standards like the GDPR become the global de facto framework for privacy.
And that gives the appearance of strength.
A huge appearance of strength. But this regulatory success is fundamentally masking a crippling technological and economic deficit in the digital age.
The Brussels effect relies on the EU's power as the world's second largest market. It's leverage. It's not invention. So you're saying this leverage gives policymakers a false sense of security about their actual capacity to compete with the US or China.
Exactly. It asserts power based on controlling market access, not based on the intrinsic strength of its own digital champions. And when you look at the raw statistics of innovation, I mean, the weakness is just undeniable.
It's pretty stark.
Despite controlling the world's largest single market and having a massive collective GDP, Europe is structurally missing from the global tech map. Only 2 of the world's 30 largest technology firms by market capitalization are European.
2 out of 30. That isn't just a slight lag, that's a structural reliance on others for the very tools that define modern commerce, geopolitics, everything. And the sources point to the R&D spending gap as probably the clearest measure of this failure to invest in the future.
The R&D spending chasm is, well, it's catastrophic. Let's just look at 2019 figures because they're indicative of these structural priorities. 5 major U.S. big tech firms, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft, they plowed a combined $109 billion into R&D.
$109 billion.
Now, let me give you the scale of that figure. That combined R&D total is roughly equal to Germany's total public and private R&D spending for the entire country in the same period.
Wait, I need to pause you there. You're telling me that just 5 private American companies spent the equivalent of the entire annual innovation budget, public research, private industry, everything of Europe's largest, most robust economy.
That's what the numbers show.
That is a staggering strategic vulnerability.
It is. It's a measure of capital concentration and redirection that Europe simply cannot match. It's due to fragmentation, a fundamentally risk-averse financial culture. You name it. If you look at the global top 11 R&D spenders, 8 of them are big tech firms from the US, China, or South Korea.
And the one from the EU.
Only one EU firm makes that list, and it's Volkswagen, an automotive manufacturer. This just highlights that the core industrial structure of the EU is static. It's concentrating capital on the middle technologies of the 20th century, while the US and Asian economies are aggressively redirecting resources towards software, AI, and digital growth.
It suggests the EU is focusing on optimizing the past, while America is investing in building the future. And this deficit is, well, it's most urgent and most visible in the field of artificial intelligence.
Oh, the AI investment chasm is probably the most worrying sign of failure. Over half of all global private investment in AI goes straight to US companies. Europe lags severely. In 2020, private funding for AI startups in the EU stood at roughly $4 billion.
$4 billion. Okay, and how does that compare?
Compare that to the US, which saw a monumental $36 billion, and China, which raised $25 billion. So that's 9 times less funding than the US.
9 times less. What does that 9-fold difference mean in practice for a European startup trying to compete with, say, a Google DeepMind or an OpenAI?
It means the speed of execution is just fundamentally hobbled. Building world-leading foundational AI models, the large language models that define this current era, it requires colossal computing power, massive data sets, and the ability to attract and pay the best, rarest talent on Earth.
And you can't do that on a shoestring budget.
A European company operating on $4 billion of collective investment simply cannot compete with a single US firm that might raise $10 billion on its own, let alone the entire US ecosystem. It translates directly into lower salaries for top engineers, slower model training, fewer iterations, and a total reliance on US-built chips and cloud services. The ability to achieve scale, the holy grail of digital disruption, is entirely dependent on that capital.
So when you look at the future unicorns, the top 100 most promising AI startups globally, it's not surprising that Europe is barely participating.
Barely is the right word. Only 5 of the top 100 are based in Europe. So you have this bizarre situation where Europe boasts these incredible world-leading intellectual assets, world-class universities, advanced expertise in quantum computing, and collectively, the EU has more skilled software engineers than the USA.
Right. The talent is there.
The talent is there. Yet Europe is failing monumentally to convert these strengths into commercial, functional, technological outcomes. The capital structure and the risk-taking culture are failing the talent.
This is what we call the startup gap, and it makes the entire continent a technological laggard. You're relying on others for breakthroughs like ChatGPT, which predictably came out of California, not Copenhagen or Berlin. It seems this ambition to lead the world in ethical AI, which is often framed as this moral imperative, is really a self-conscious attempt to secure a space in the AI sector through regulatory muscle, rather than engineering prowess.
It's the ultimate expression of digital sovereignty as a sociological defense mechanism. It's a manifestation of institutional pride used to mask a systemic inability to compete. By attempting to define the market as a battleground for regulation, Europe is, it's fighting a war using its legal department instead of its engineering department.
And the outcome is pretty predictable.
The unfortunate outcome is that the winners and losers in this battle will ultimately be determined by America and China, not the EU itself.
It gets really disheartening when you look at the EU's response to this deficit. Instead of, recognizing the capital gap and the need for massive deregulation, the response has been to just double down on regulation, specifically with the Artificial Intelligence Act, or the AIA. The stated goal is to assert power and protect citizens, but the sources we've seen suggest it risks making Europe a profoundly non-competitive environment.
The AIA is the crystallization of this regulatory-first mindset. It's a horizontal law, which means it cuts across all sectors, and it sorts AI systems into 3 categories. Prohibited, like social scoring, dominant risk, and high risk. The problem is how incredibly broad that high-risk designation is.
So what falls under high risk? Is it just drones and medical devices, or is it broader?
Oh, it's much, much broader. It covers a vast, expansive swath of potential applications that are just central to modern economies. This includes AI systems used in critical infrastructure, like energy and transport. It includes systems for educational training and vocational assessment. It includes systems in employment, management of workers, and access to self-employment, and in essential public and private services, like credit scoring or dispatching emergency services.
So basically everything.
And this subjects those systems to extensive conformity assessments, technical documentation, mandatory record keeping, all before they can even be placed on the market.
This sounds like the structural erosion of technological meritocracy through administrative bloat. It's where procedural compliance is now prioritized over functional excellence. You're creating a paperwork-intensive, permission-first culture.
That is the core affliction. The Act operates the precautionary principle not as a balanced guideline, but as an infinitely elastic mandate for regulatory expansion. It says, basically, if something might be risky, we will regulate it to death, even if that risk is purely theoretical and the benefit is immediate.
It codifies administrative bloat.
It does. The consequence is prioritizing filling out forms, explaining how a black box deep learning model reached its conclusion over actually refining the model, reducing latency, or improving accuracy. It's a task that is, for many complex AI, mathematically impossible.
And we can actually quantify the immense cost of this administrative burden, which should matter a great deal to the taxpayer and the consumer.
Absolutely. The Center for Data Innovation has quantified this precisely. They estimate these compliance burdens are said to cost European businesses a staggering 10.9 billion euros annually by 2025. Annually. Over a 5-year period, that's 31 billion euros in direct compliance costs. And that massive figure, crucially, excludes the opportunity costs, the lost investment, the businesses that decide to just skip the EU market altogether, and the time spent by engineers acting as compliance officers instead of engineers.
That is money being diverted from R&D and product improvement directly into bureaucracy and legal auditing, and the impact's just fundamentally damaging, especially to the small, agile innovators.
It creates a massive regressive tax on innovation. Just consider the data. A small, high-growth business with an annual asset turnover of, say, 10 million euros could easily face up to 400,000 euros in compliance costs, just for bringing a single high-risk AI product to market.
And that would consume?
That consumes 40% of its potential profits before they even make a single sale. Now contrast that with the fines for non-compliance, which are severe, up to 20 million euros, or 4% of total global annual turnover.
So if a small startup makes a genuine mistake, it's existential. If a Google or a Microsoft makes a mistake, they pay a manageable fine. This structure systematically disadvantages the agile disruptors and overwhelmingly favors the large incumbents.
It entrenches existing market leaders. American big tech companies already have massive, well-funded legal and lobbying departments that can absorb these compliance costs as a low marginal expense. They can hire 50 more lawyers to churn out the necessary documentation.
A 5-person European startup cannot.
They can't. This is what we mean by political cleansing of merit. The regulatory process becomes a filter that systematically disadvantages excellence-driven innovators in favor of large organizations with existing bureaucratic machinery.
And we see the agonizing human cost of this dynamic in the story of Elena, the Munich software engineer. It's a perfect example of how process kills potential.
Elena was developing an algorithm for early-stage retinal degradation detection. A potentially life-saving breakthrough that could prevent blindness if it's detected early enough. Her code was lean, it was effective, it was validated in clinical trials. But once the AI Act loomed, she didn't get to spend her time refining the model with doctors, improving its accuracy from 97% to 99%.
No, instead she spent 18 months trapped in administrative limbo.
18 months.
What was the specific friction point that consumed all that time?
She was dealing with impact assessment officers, and these were non-technical bureaucrats who required her to document in granular detail how her deep learning algorithm arrived at its decision, how the black box functioned.
Which is something she can't fully explain.
Because the algorithm relies on complex nonlinear processing, she was essentially being asked to write a novel explaining why a cloud looks like a cloud. The officials lacked the technical competence to understand her work, but they held the power to grant or deny market access based entirely on paperwork. And this just diverted critical engineering and financial resources away from actual R&D.
And the outcome was catastrophic.
The funding dried up. The venture capitalists looked at the situation, 18 months of no market access, spiraling legal bills, the sheer regulatory risk, and they deemed the compliance risk to be far higher than the potential innovation reward.
The legal profile killed the project.
It killed the project before it could help a single patient. It transforms digital compliance into a wealth transfer mechanism upwards toward the administrative, legal, and consultancy classes and away from the actual producers of technology.
This regulatory-first approach, this idea that you can legislate disruption in advance, it seems fundamentally detached from reality. You can't predict the next innovation breakthrough by writing rules for the current one.
It completely reads history backward. Can you imagine regulators in 1995 trying to define the exact use cases and safety parameters for a future company called Google? It's absurd. Innovation is an organic process. It's rooted in risk, failure, and emergent behavior. The moment Brussels attempts to predefine all use cases for future AI-based products, it is effectively ensuring that those breakthrough products will simply be innovated elsewhere. The law attempts to freeze a moment in time that technology constantly shatters.
The policymakers, they seem dimly aware of the inhibitive effect they're causing, which is why they introduce concepts like regulatory sandboxes. This is their attempt to prove they're innovation-friendly.
They frequently talk about the new European innovation agenda, which includes these sandboxes, these well-defined environments intended to provide temporary exemptions for trials of innovative products that wouldn't otherwise be compliant. But if you actually analyze their function, they are merely expressions of the existing legal limits.
So you're just playing in their sandbox by their rules.
The innovator spends their time solving the specific bureaucratic problems set by the EU, rather than solving a real-world technological problem that could achieve global scale. It views innovation as something that can be dictated from above, like turning on a bureaucratic switch, rather than a bottom-up, messy, emergent process.
It sounds like a distraction from the fundamental fact that premature, overly complex regulation throttles entrepreneurship, guarantees the innovation gap widens, and ensures the EU continues to lose ground in the AI race. The strategy is pure regulatory capacity, while the US and China focus on generating practical, profitable, and powerful outcomes.
This failure to foster a competitive environment is then amplified by a critical weakness in the financial and talent ecosystem. And this leads to what we can only describe as an innovation drain, a systematic flight of the brightest entrepreneurial minds and the most valuable capital.
The financial component is the necessary bridge for innovation, and Europe seems to have these structural issues that prevent capital from taking the risks needed for disruption. How is the law specifically limiting venture capital investment in Europe?
Well, the law governing institutional investment in Europe is just far too conservative. Consider pension and endowment funds. In the U.S., these are the lifeblood of massive early-stage VC funding.
Right.
In Europe, restrictive regulations limit the fees these funds can pay to venture capitalists. They're often restricted to paying only around 0.3% in management fees, compared to the industry standard 2% in the U.S. Profit sharing, the carry, is also often capped or heavily regulated.
So if the fund managers can't take big risks and earn commensurate rewards, they are structurally incentivized to just invest in stable, mature, predictable assets, not disruptive, early-stage, high-risk technologies that could yield tenfold returns.
Exactly. The lack of incentive structure starves the entire ecosystem, and the VC investment data reflects this immediately. Venture capital investment in the U.S. stood at a monumental $150 billion in 2020. In the EU, it was over 3 times less, at $40 billion. Globally, 50% of global VC investments go to U.S. companies, a third to Asia, and only 13% to Europe. On a per capita basis, VC investments are almost 7 times higher in the United States compared to Germany or France.
That difference creates a persistent Series B gap, doesn't it?
Yeah.
European companies might get initial seed funding, but when they need that massive second or third round to scale globally, to hire hundreds of engineers and enter new markets, the capital simply isn't there in Europe. It forces them to look across the Atlantic.
That's precisely where the ecosystem breaks down, and it leads directly to the exit problem. I mean, the whole point of VC funding is the successful exit, the IPO, or the acquisition, which returns capital to the investors, which then fuels the next generation of startups.
The flywheel effect.
And that flywheel effect is broken in Europe. In 2019, venture capital-backed exits came to a paltry $19 billion in Europe. Compare that to a massive $290 billion in the United States.
The lack of successful exits means the capital pool stays shallow, risk aversion becomes entrenched, and the whole system becomes self-limiting. The only logical outcome of this capital gap and this compliance burden is the brain and entrepreneurship drain.
It is an exodus of talent. The most ambitious, fast-growing European AI startups are forced to seek friendlier territories, and we have hard data confirming this. Between 2008 and 2021, nearly 30% of unicorns founded in Europe, those prize startups valued over $1 billion, relocated their headquarters abroad.
And the vast majority went to the U.S.?
Predictably, yes.
What specifically pushes them to relocate, besides just the sheer availability of capital?
It's the entire innovation culture and the proximity to decision makers. One French entrepreneur noted that French startups that establish a U.S. presence raise 2.3 times more capital than those that remain purely domestic. They see their web traffic and customer acquisition grow 50% faster. They move because the U.S. offers 2 things Europe lacks: abundant risk capital and a minimal compliance drag. If European entrepreneurs have to leave the EU to realize their ambitions, that is the most stinging indictment of the EU's current regulatory and financial practices.
Beyond the financial structures, this whole situation also exposes some profound bureaucratic incompetence and disorganization at the highest levels of the EU Commission when it comes to prioritizing innovation.
The structure of the Commission itself seems hostile to speed and singular focus. Despite acknowledging the problem and allocating 13.5 billion euros for startup and scale-up support in the Horizon Europe budget, the EU Commission has no single official in charge of startups.
That's truly remarkable for an area they've deemed critical to future economic security. No singular strategic commander.
Responsibility is just splintered across multiple commissioners. Thierry Breton for the internal market, Maria Gabriel for innovation, others handling financial services and regional development. Their portfolios overlap, but they are ultimately siloed. This fragmentation means that supporting startups becomes everyone's rhetorical priority, but no one's actionable exclusive focus. It creates crippling bottlenecks and delays.
And we saw this play out disastrously with the European Innovation Council, the EIC, which was supposed to be the big answer to the capital problem.
The EIC was launched with so much fanfare, with a promise of over 10 billion euros to act as the EU's primary body for high-risk, deep-tech startup financing. However, the program has been fundamentally dogged by bureaucracy. The organizational structure was characterized by departmental infighting, risk aversion in selecting grant recipients, and incredibly slow auditing and dispersal processes. The funds just have not been forthcoming.
To the point where it became a scandal.
A huge scandal. The EIC is now the subject of a parliamentary investigation.
An innovation council that is under investigation because its own bureaucratic process prevented it from funding innovation. It's almost a perfect metaphor for the entire problem.
It demonstrates this stultifying top-down culture that just struggles to adapt to the speed and risk tolerance required for a genuine innovation ecosystem. And consider a critical detail that's often overlooked: attracting top global talent. In the U.S., stock options and equity rewards are key to attracting and retaining the best personnel.
Of course. That's how you get people to commit to a 5 or 10-year gamble on a startup.
Exactly. But unfavorable tax treatment of stock options in many EU member countries, and taxation is a national competence, making EU-wide harmonization incredibly difficult. It means European startups can't offer competitive incentives. Given the urgency of the AI gap and the ongoing brain drain, you'd think the EU would have tackled this years ago.
You would think.
But no. The EU is only now, remarkably, setting up a working group of member countries in 2023 to examine the equity issue. This lackadaisical multi-year approach suggests they either don't truly grasp the stakes or they genuinely believe regulatory power is a sufficient substitute for market dynamism.
So let's pivot to the larger strategic consequences of all this. When the EU turns inward to focus on creating this legally perfect digital monolith obsessed with compliance and control, what does that actually do to its global position? Doesn't this regulatory purity fundamentally undermine its strategic independence?
It absolutely leads to profound strategic vulnerability because it compromises the fundamental ability to guarantee continuous access to dependable technological capabilities, or CTCs. In today's world, strategic autonomy rests on who controls the data, the cloud, the hardware, and the software. When you're dependent on others for these means of production, your geopolitical influence is inherently limited.
And the dependency in the cloud is stark. I mean, this is where most modern computation happens, where AI models are trained and where data resides.
Control over cloud computing is the new foundation of state power. Today, 4 global companies, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, and Alibaba Cloud, they control 67% of the global cloud market. Europe houses only 24% of the world's cloud data centers, compared to the US and Canada combined, which account for over 70%.
Why does the physical location of the data center matter so much if data can be transmitted globally in milliseconds?
It matters because of jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Foreign providers are subject to their home country's laws, which is a massive liability. US-based cloud providers are subject to the Cloud Act, which allows US authorities to request access to data stored abroad without necessarily notifying the government of the data owner's country.
Okay.
Similarly, Chinese cloud providers must cooperate with Chinese intelligence agencies under their national security laws.
So reliance on foreign cloud providers, especially for critical infrastructure, banking, healthcare, military logistics, means that Europe's strategic autonomy is immediately constrained by the sovereign laws of the United States and China. That's a huge geopolitical blind spot.
It's an enforced dependence. And in response to this, the EU often champions data localization mandates. The idea that data generated in Europe must stay in Europe. But the sources suggest this actually acts as an acidic solvent that dissolves the efficiency and synergy of the Western technological ecosystem.
How does insisting on local data storage actively degrade Europe's technological capabilities? It seems counterintuitive.
Data localization mandates are essentially non-tariff barriers that force the balkanization of data infrastructure. They're designed to assert digital control, but they achieve this by sacrificing the crucial elements necessary for modern AI development: massive scale, lightning speed, and data synergy.
Right.
AI models thrive on enormous, unified, and diverse data sets. By forcing data into localized national silos, Europe fragments its data sets, making it mathematically harder for its companies to train world-leading algorithms compared to the unified continental-scale data sets available to the U.S. private sector or the Chinese state.
So, in the name of sovereignty, Europe is actively making its own companies less competitive at the foundational level of data science. And the cost of this fragmentation is measurable too.
Absolutely. An IDC survey predicted that over the next 4 years, 50% of European organizations will spend 10% of their entire ICT budget just complying with these internal, self-imposed data sovereignty principles.
10% of their tech budget.
That's a monumental cost dedicated purely to administrative compliance and legal friction, rather than investment in innovation, R&D, or growth. It represents a collective, intentional deindustrialization of the digital sphere in the name of control.
And this inward regulatory turn also highlights the profound structural flaw in the EU's consensus-based decision-making. It's just too slow for the hyperspeed of technological evolution.
The timeline of the AI Act is a shocking example of this structural flaw. Discussions began in 2019. The formal legislative pass concluded in early 2024. Then member states have up to 2 additional years to incorporate it into national law.
So it won't be fully in place until 2026.
Perhaps. And by the time the AI Act is fully implemented across the continent, it will already be severely outdated. Why? Because the rapid advancement of AI, epitomized by breakthroughs like ChatGPT, occurred while the EU was still debating the initial draft.
So the technology moves on a timescale of months, but the EU's decision-making process moves on a timescale of half a decade.
It's a reactive approach. The U.S., in contrast, began its policy discussions after the ChatGPT breakthrough and quickly produced an executive order in late 2023 to manage the risks and encourage innovation. The EU's slow, fragmented, consensus-based process leaves it consistently behind the curve, attempting to regulate yesterday's technology while others are busy inventing tomorrow's.
And this fragmentation also extends to competition policies, specifically the Digital Markets Act, or DMA. While the DMA aims to break up the power of existing U.S. tech giants, it seems to be hindering the EU's ability to foster its own industry champions.
The DMA is preoccupied with leveraging digital sovereignty, refereeing the game, at the explicit expense of technological capabilities, the ability to build, to compete. The intent is noble, of course, to reduce the dominance of gatekeepers like Google, Amazon, and Apple. But its execution relies on static thinking.
Explain that. How does that static thinking end up protecting the very incumbents it's meant to challenge?
Well, the DMA assumes the structure of the digital market today will remain static. It imposes rules preventing gatekeepers from cross-leveraging data across their various services to improve their products. For example, the DMA might prevent a company like Apple from using aggregate data from its App Store usage to refine and improve its own internal search function in an attempt to challenge Google's search dominance.
So by limiting the ability of other giants like Apple or Meta to use their vast resources to disrupt Google's core search business, the DMA inadvertently creates legal barriers that actually protect Google's dominance.
Precisely. It ends up preserving market positions as they exist today. It penalizes the incentive to disrupt, and in doing so, it overlooks the massive, genuinely disruptive innovations like generative AI, such as the fundamental challenge to search posed by technologies like ChatGPT. The DMA is trying to manage 2010 platform wars in 2024, ensuring that market competition is limited to the existing framework rather than welcoming genuine European-led upheaval.
So the EU's open market, coupled with its fragmented national security policies, allows both trusted and untrusted foreign providers to capture massive market shares, all while its own competition rules prevent the emergence of homegrown champions capable of challenging them. It's a strategy of guarantees long-term vulnerability.
And so, we circle back to the opening anecdote. The EU regulatory official saw himself as writing the Constitution for the future of humanity. Yet what we've demonstrated is that this is an institution trying desperately to control outcomes, while the US and China are defining the very foundations, the capacity, the capital, and the technological standards of that future.
The Brussels effect is, in this context, really precarious. It's a structure of authority built on the shifting sand of regulatory zeal. This aggressive pursuit of legal perfection, embodied by the AI Act and the DMA, risks erecting a legal digital monolith that actively inhibits future European innovation and accelerates its geopolitical decline.
Regulation, by its very nature, is post festum. It's after the fact.
Right. Regulators are always playing catch-up. And by focusing only on the sphere of the known, the existing technology, they are creating barriers that choke off the necessary experimentation.
And the problem transcends mere law or economics. It's rooted in a fundamental, pervasive cultural issue. It is a risk-averse culture that permeates European society, politics, and finance. New technology is often instinctively dismissed as dangerous, and institutional structures are socialized into safetyism. This culture just lacks the necessary appetite for the kind of risk-taking that disruptive innovation requires.
The fact that Europe has the world-class talent and the financial wealth, but its most ambitious entrepreneurs are consistently forced to leave for Singapore, Tel Aviv, or California to realize their potential. That is the ultimate indictment of this inward-looking defensive mindset.
Europe needs a fundamental reorientation, away from the comfortable position of refereeing what exists towards the ambitious, risk-taking, and capital-intensive approach that would actually build the digital future.
The future belongs to those who are willing to take risks and create it. If Europe continues to prioritize prohibition over creation, its assertion of digital sovereignty will only serve to accelerate its geopolitical decline, cementing its status not as a global digital player, but as a wealthy, well-regulated technological laggard whose fate is determined by others.